I'm John Grady. I'm based in Seattle, Washington, and I'm here to talk about a new sculptural installation called Middle Fork. I'm really largely driven when making these projects by what would it be like to be near or in or aside that object with my body, that it becomes of the body, and I think that's why scale is so important. So with smaller works, you can accomplish a lot more in a more limited amount of time, but it's with a large piece like Middle Fork where your body engages it and you get to really have that experience of something like the interior of a tree that becomes most compelling. The genesis for my work is usually based on some kind of beautiful little moment I have. In the case of Middle Fork, it was walking through the forest and seeing a nurse log laid out 100 feet on the ground and just wondering to myself, what would it be like if I could move through the interior of that log, that fallen tree. There's a kind of an inversion to what you might think in terms of sketches and maquettes in my work. They almost always happen after I've finished a piece. So there's a drawing in this exhibition called Sink and Resist, and it happened, in this case, after another sculpture that's not in this exhibit, but before the large Middle Fork piece. And I think it makes sense to have in this exhibit because it's actually drawn from an aerial view of a river changing over time. And it's interesting to see how similar that is formally to this cross-section of a tree. The process of creating the sculpture began by casting a living, standing, old-growth hemlock tree. And we put a thin casing of foil, and then over that plastered the tree. And that involved rigging the tree with arborists, so there were several of us doing that for about 10 days. And then taking that cast off the tree was another adventure. And then after that, we then took that cast and built very meticulously all of the wood forms that you see in the sculpture now. When I thought about making the sculpture, it was really a kind of an ode to a year in the life of the tree. And by that I mean, if we were to take the sculpture as it is now and put it back on the standing living tree, it would fit, just like a piece of custom-made clothing. But in 2 years from now, it would no longer fit on the tree because the tree would have grown the distance of the sculpture itself. So it's that very specific piece of life of the tree. And for me, what it gave us access to in the gallery in an interesting way was seeing it horizontally and getting this interior view of a tree that we just otherwise would never have any way of seeing. It's taken the work of something like 75 or 80 people helping to contribute to make this piece. It takes actually much longer than you might even imagine looking at it. So there's this challenge of how do you make something very elaborate without it becoming this extraordinarily expensive thing? And I think the best way of doing that is thinking through a project that might be compelling for people to want to volunteer and help with. One thing I've found with something like rock climbing, where you're needing to engage something in the landscape very specifically and understand it very, very carefully because you're going to fall off the wall if you don't. In this case, we were getting to experience all the nuances of the outside of this tree as we cast it. And I thought to myself how wondrous that would be for people that are helping to make it, to have that kind of intimate engagement. And that's really what they had when all these people were helping to lay out each of these individual pieces that you see in the sculpture. And it was also important to me that everybody that was helping get to help determine the direction of each of those little pieces. So what you're seeing isn't so much this mandate from me where I've mapped everything out. It's much more an editing process where people will go in and make certain decisions in terms of the size and the direction that each of these little lines is taking, and it becomes a conversation between them and me. After the sculpture's been shown in a number of different venues, we can then return the tree to the base. It's important to me that the work has some kind of element of change, that it goes back into the landscape. In this case, with Middle Fork, that it rots away and completely returns to the ground. And it's important to me because it removes a certain layer of preciousness. There's something inherently precious in the piece right now because it's so elaborately made. And it also just speaks to larger issues that we are all going to face in terms of mortality, that we actually watch the trajectory of something change instead of trying to preserve it indefinitely.